The European Viw Podcast. Your place to navigate the insights of our policy journal, brought to you by the Martenscentre. With Sara Pini.
Hello, and welcome to the European Viw Podcast, your new way to navigate through the main issues of our policy journal with valuable insights from the authors themselves. I'm Sara Pini, the Assistant Editor-in-Chief of the European Viw and a Senior Research Officer at the Martenscentre. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming Suzanne Schneider, who is core faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and a visiting fellow at Kellogg College in Oxford. Suzanne wrote a very interesting article titled Owning the Liberal International Order for the latest issue of the European Viw, which was dedicated to the future of transatlantic relations. As always, you can find this and all the other articles of the European Viw on our website, martenscentre.eu. So, Suzanne, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's start with the article. You outline three tactics used by the Trump administration in foreign policy: unilateralism, economic warfare, and the personalization of diplomacy. Which one should Europe be more concerned or at least wary about, and how should we deal with it?
I mean, is all of the above an option? The reality is that it's really hard to disentangle these things. And that, I wrote this article kind of trying to read the tea leaves at the end of January. And it seems that since then, each one of these has become kind of, quite evident in different moves and maneuvers that he's made, even kind of within the last few days. I think that the most concerning thing should be the kind of tying of the, the defense umbrella to American economic and particularly Donald Trump's kind of economic priorities. And that's not just a narrow kind of question of tariffs, but also how this administration thinks about its kind of pet political projects, kind of threats to the European Union's regulatory bodies if they don't comply with what American tech giants do. I think that this sort of entanglement between the kind of political and the economic is quite worrying. And would kind of be something, I would be watching very closely from the European point of view.
You speak also about a coalition of engineers and traditionalists that are supporting Trump. Two factions that at the first glance seem like night and day. So what is bringing these people together? What do you have in common?
Yeah, so I've kind of been playing around with this idea for, about the last year or so, growing out of a lot of the journalistic writing I've done on conservative movements around the world, and particularly the forces that are often called the New Right. And I've tried to chart in my writing how the New Right has all of these kind of, different factions, and that they are not really united on a number of things. And in fact, advanced competing social, political, and economic visions often. And so, two of the most kind of prominent that I see right now are, yes, as I've termed them, the engineers, who are the kind of Silicon Valley, you know, formerly techno-libertarians. There's a lot of reasons I think that libertarianism is not the appropriate way to think about what people who are building surveillance companies are doing. But you have the kind of Silicon Valley, they're very future oriented. They're experimenting with all of these kind of crazy Nietzschean inspired experiments in longevity, space colonization, always kind of looking at what the kind of current borders are of human social and moral order, and thinking about pushing beyond that. And on the other hand, you have the traditionalists who have coalesced around the national conservatism movement in the United States, of which, J.D. Vance is probably the most prominent spokesperson, who very much kind of, almost sound like social democrats at times, kind of thinking about ways in which the market needs to be tamed in order to serve the needs of a nation that can be reconstituted along traditional moral lines. So yes, how do these people seem to have anything in common, or how do they, how have they found it kind of, how have they managed to kind of work together? And I think really at the end of the day, as I've kind of tried to chart in this article, part of it is just enmity, right? A kind of sense of a common enmity toward a liberal international order in particular. which for the engineers is kind of symbolized by kind of overreach by either EU or UN or other kind of regulatory bodies that are kind of cautious and advancing principles, that advise precaution in the face of various risks. Right, all of these things seem to be stifling their kind of autonomy and freedom, so they claim. And on the other hand, you have the traditionalists who are also extremely critical of those same international bodies, but kind of coming at it from the perspective of really fetishizing national sovereignty, the nation state as the kind of primary unit of politics, national culture, national tradition, so on and so forth, and looking at institutions that operate at a global level as being, the kind of the tame version of this is that they impede upon the national sovereignty of member states by kind of creating these abstract systems of supposedly universal law that actually don't apply. This is the argument you get kind of constantly from Yoram Hazony, who's a kind of Israeli academic who's at the forefront of this movement. So you have it from that all the way to, Peter Thiel has recently suggested that actually this global governance is the Antichrist, right? This is like literally the Antichrist, speaking in quite apocalyptic terms about these kind of global regulatory frameworks. And Thiel is an interesting figure as somebody who actually really bridges the gap between the kind of engineers and the traditionalists. So you have a shared enmity toward liberal internationalism, even though it's coming from different places. The issue is that kind of coalition is much stronger externally, but when it turns to kind of domestic policy, I think that the fissures become much more pronounced because one of these, parties at the end of the day is still kind of abides by a certain free market fundamentalism, and one of them is kind of talking about a, renewed welfare state, at least for what they considers to be the kind of real or true Americans.
Of course, there's been a major change in this coalition since you wrote this article, because when you wrote it, Musk and Trump were still in their honeymoon phase, at least on the surface. So, what consequences will their messy breakup have on U.S. policy, in particular for foreign policy, if any?
I don't know what immediate impacts or fallouts there will be in foreign policy. I think, Trump is such a unilateralist. He'll kind of continue to pursue, whatever kind of pops into his head that day. He kind of he certainly considers the kind of, feedback from these various parts of the constituency. But ultimately, you're right, he kind of thrives on being independent and unpredictable. So I don't know if there's going to be immediate fallout of the Musk kind of relationship. I think what it is designed to do is actually to send a message internally. It's a way for the president to discipline the kind of billionaire crew in his ranks. And I think actually the example of kind of Vladimir Putin and the way kind of he's related to Russia's oligarchs is kind of quite illustrative in this regard. He really prefers his billionaires to be docile. And I think that, Donald Trump absolutely kind of is going to be following this playbook. And trying to keep these forces of capital, particularly from Silicon Valley, that threw enormous amounts of money into his campaign, on the side of at least acquiescing to his kind of policy, priorities, even if they don't kind of fully embrace them, right? Or at least Musk kind of steps over the line in kind of having this kind of public renunciation. But I think that, again, there's something more fascinating happening here. When you think about the relative strength of kind of state and market forces and the ways in which they both work to kind of discipline a figure like Musk. There was a huge amount of kind of uproar about, the Tesla stock prices were, and kind of investor sentiment being quite unhappy with his involvement in the administration. So there's a sense of kind of the markets pushing him to create more distance between himself and the administration. And then the administration, they have this fallout, and the price just absolutely plummets Tesla stock. Now, but if you look at that stock over the last year, it's really interesting because it's plummeted to a point that it's still, essentially a little bit higher than it was, on November 5th when Donald Trump won, which indicates something that the kind of hype around that stock was always about access, was always about this sense of access to the great leader. And, I developed this idea of a patronage market in this and kind of some other writing that I'd been doing, where really the accumulation of capital hinges upon access to those in key government positions. And I think that this is what's happening in Silicon Valley, particularly as these companies pivot to defense technologies, AI-powered defense technologies. It's this massive kind of growth sector. And you just see the kind of, real kind of close relations being cemented between the market and the state. And so I think the Musk kind of fall from grace is a sort of cautionary tale, not necessarily right to the other people in the kind of in the billionaire kind of Silicon Valley space. I think that's more the significance rather than impacting kind of policy at the international level.
You mentioned Peter Thiel before, who is probably, as you said, more disciplined or less provocative than Musk. Maybe it's also because of this that he's less known in Europe to the wider public, let's say. But he still has a strong influence on U.S. policy. Where do you think this influence is more visible, more important?
It's truly remarkable. I mean, it's kind of across the board. So I think, but I think on both the kind of foreign and domestic policy fronts, and at the end of the day, they're entangled. And it's going to be interesting to see, Teal is just one part of this coalition, of course. And I think that, it's interesting, and his incentives are slightly different than those of, say, the kind of MAGA base. If you take, something like kind of support for, weapons to Ukraine, this is something that is extremely unpopular with the MAGA base, which Teal has kind of hedged on and said, one way, one day, another day, another way, another day. But at the end of the day, his company Palantir, which is the kind of surveillance company, stands to benefit immensely from expanded NATO spending. So, you have these kind of competing incentive structures in place that I think you kind of have to keep track of. But it does mean that kind of for the Trump administration, kind of navigating this, this internal rift in its coalition, particularly with regard to how active the United States is going to be on the world stage, that this is going to be one of the kind of very crucial things that this administration has to do.
So, what is clear from what I read of you, and not just from you, is that Trump is not an isolated accident. It's not just he himself as a person. What he represents, what brought him to power, is here to stay. It started before his election, and it will not go away at the end of his term. What do you think will be the long-term consequences of this philosophy that in your article at a certain point you call the ramblings of online philosophers for American society and political system?
So I guess there's a few different ways into this question. On the one hand, I don't think that this is an aberration, and I don't think that there is ever a kind of going back to the before times. In some ways, you can say that liberalism. It's a strange phenomenon. In that the kind of on the one hand, the liberal order seems to be done and seems to be through, even though it never really fully existed. In at least according to kind of its own theories and models, and that was part of its weakness, is its kind of hypocrisies, its points of omission. So I think we are at this rupture where the world that we have known is gone, and the question is, what sort of alternatives are we credibly able to put forward to the kind of kind of right-wing authoritarian populist vision of Donald Trump and all of his friends at the global stage. And we should underscore that the kind of what they have on offer is an extremely violent society. And this has become clear if you look at the kind of recent, if you look at the kind of the recent budget that was passed in the United States, which has completely gutted any sort of social welfare programs across the board, whether for food assistance or housing or medical care for poor people, and shifted all of those funds toward defense spending, erecting a border wall, detention centers. Right, as we see states in the kind of throes of a legitimacy crisis, and as they get more and more illegitimate, they get more and more violent. This is something we see across this globe, and we should be extremely concerned about this. So, any kind of the question is to well, what comes next? It's, well, are we able to kind of put forth a credible alternative? And we have to first understand how we got to this point, that the status quo, this sort of kind of market fundamentalism, which has been the dominant kind of governing strategy of certainly both Democrats and Republicans in the United States for the past 40 years, has produced all of these structural crises that has robbed the system of any sense of legitimacy, robbed kind of the kind of expert class of any sense of legitimacy, and paved the way for someone who presents themselves as an outsider, but whose real attribute is not that Donald Trump is not going to solve the woes of the working class, but at least he's not the status quo. At least he's not the same old thing. And I think until we fully grapple with just how much the kind of the system as it was failing everyday people and are able to put forth a kind of credible alternative again, then the kind of right-wing populists will continue to rule the day. And from what I've seen in the United States, the kind of centrist Democrats do not have any sort of kind of political capacity or imagination to offer that sort of message. So to some extent, the influence of this is going to depend on what the opposition does, on the one hand, and whether what will this kind of all crash and burn in some sort of spectacular way? I don't know. It's possible, but it does seem to me that things will get worse before they will get better, and that this kind of overall pivot towards societies which are more and more violent, which are held together by kind of coercive capabilities, that this will continue until somebody is able to offer a credible alternative.
And I guess what you say applies both to the US domestic situation, but also to the international border, because as you said, what the coalition supporting Trump has in common, what both factions have in common, is their strong dislike, let's say, to put it mildly,
Yeah.
of the international liberal order. And you conclude. I love the way you conclude your article. I invite everyone to go and read it. But basically, you conclude with the call, in particular to Europe, to keep this international order alive. But as you said, this order had problems. The system failed. So how could liberal internationalism be reinvented to succeed in today's violent and fractured world?
I kind of made the joke before that liberalism is both kind of on its way out and yet has never existed, at least according to its own kind of theoretical parameters. So as much as there are kind of failings built within that system, I don't think that there's a credible alternative to the idea of kind of some sort of global coordination around various risks that are some of which are truly existential on the one hand, around kind of the principles of universal human rights, of the rule of law, right? So there's much within this order that kind of deserves saving, but yet there are, I think that on the international scale, we have to be kind of more critical about in the same way that kind of same exercise we engage in domestically in the United States about how has this thing been brought to crisis and how have people stopped to believe in it. The same conversation has to happen on the international level. What were the kind of points of crisis? How did people stop believing in this? It's kind of quite evident that those things there's a few things we can look at. Kind of the kind of seeming hypocrisies of this order on the one hand. It's kind of, promotion of democracy and the rule of law, and it's kind of, opportunistic support of kind of, dictatorial regimes and kind of anti-democratic regimes as long as they serve the needs of capital on the other, right? Just the general idea that investor sentiment is more important than the kind of actual needs or opinions of one's own people. I think that there really has to be a kind of recalibration of the relationship between kind of democracy and democratic sovereignty and markets if there is going to be any sort of legitimacy restored to the system. And again, taking kind of quite seriously some of the critiques of the system, of its blind spots, of its hypocrisies that emerge from the global south. I just don't think that there's any way you can, think about a rebuilt international order that is just kind of wholly, tilted toward or kind of gives this kind of continued outside importance to a few dozen countries in Western Europe and North America. So I think, all of those things will be important if there's going to be some sort of credible alternative on the international stage.
Okay, well, let's hope that we find a credible alternative because, as you said, otherwise the alternative is scary, no? Okay, so Suzanne, thank you very much for this really interesting and topical discussion.
My pleasure.
And for those listening in, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe and discover all interesting insight of the European Viw on our website, martenscentre.eu, and on our social media channel. Thank you and stay tuned for more.
This was the European Viw Podcast, your place to navigate the insights of our policy journal. Follow the Martens Centre for more.